Chapter 14, Authenticity, the tipping point of cultural change. Any broad cultural change happens when a movement towards change reaches a critical mass, what Malcolm Gladwell refers to as the tipping point. In a theoretically democratic system, this would be the moment when 51% of the population adopts a certain opinion. In reality, general acceptance of new ideas leaps well past 51% when a substantial minority of cultural influencers adopt the new mode of thinking. This substantial minority is usually somewhere around 20%, but it's dependent on a variety of factors, including how big the change of opinion is and how popular and influential the members in the minority are considered. An important example is the explosive growth of Christianity within the Roman Empire in the 4th century. Although the estimates are not precise, it is generally accepted that the number of Christians swelled around 10% in 300 AD to 55% by 380, a massive increase. What changed? The answer, of course, that the most powerful and influential man within the empire, Emperor Constantine, became a Christian. It's important to note that while there are endless debates about the nature of his conversion and its effect, what is always in question is the sincerity of his faith and the faith of those who followed his example, not the actual popularity of Christianity. In other words, the conversions were authentic, if not sincere. However, we can also question the authenticity of that form of Christianity by suggesting that many sincere adherents going along with the change in culture were simply practicing the same old paganism with a Christian facelift. In reality, some of column A and column B joined the true believers, those with authentic sincerity and sincere authenticity, in what was really a change of prophylicity. What we know for sure is that the most important thing to upward mobility from the 4th century onward was the outward appearance of Christian belief and piety. Recognizing the impact of elite cultural forces is crucial for understanding the changes within the 20th century and beyond, because the broad reach of newspapers, radio, and television magnified both the breadth and depth of cultural change possible worldwide. Constantine's conversion had a rapid change, yet we know that it was largely superficial in the immediate. It may have been both sincere and authentic for himself, but on the outer reaches of the empire, most people were not greatly affected by the statue of Zeus being swapped out for a crucifix. The small minority of Christians within a village may have experienced an initial boost of excitement, but were likely disappointed as soon as they discovered their neighbors paying the same superficial respect to Jesus as they had to the pagan gods. The culture of sincerity was preserved in business dealing and relationships, but religious change was insincere prophylicity. The only people concerned with authenticity were the Christians, who needed ways to vet the sincerity of converts seeking to become more substantially involved within the church. In some sleepy backwater, this was not hard to do because there was no clear gain to be had. However, it's clear that there was a considerable amount of elite infiltration in the church hierarchy on both sides of the empire, where political power trumped ecclesiastical authority. Many bad apples became men of the cloth for personal or political gain, and there has been a long history of nepotism, buying offices, titles, appointments, embezzlement, and all other forms of corruption. Insincere authenticity and inauthentic sincerity abounded, but the outward signs and access to them were closely protected. We could call this opportunistic insincerity or sincere prophylicity. When we look forward to the 20th century, what were the drivers behind the switch from sincerity to authenticity? The messages came from Rousseau and Freud, among others, and were streamlined for consumption by Bernays, But the effects were so powerful because a culture of sincerity is highly susceptible to radical authenticity. Sincerity values the experience of the receiver in communication over that of the speaker. The onus is on understanding rather than being understood. Thus, when the boomer generation began speaking to their parents and other authorities from their authentic self, it was taken seriously and it was taken sincerely, which it likely was, at least at first. We can consider the example of the television show All in the Family. Archie and Edith come from the culture of sincerity. They subdue their inner reservations about certain things to preserve their public reputation. This is not to say there is no authenticity. We understand that Archie is a little more free to speak his mind in his own home than he is out and about, but that does not make his outward prolificity inauthentic because he believes sincerely in the difference between public and private spaces. Gloria and Meathead are of the culture of authenticity, and as such, they place a greater value on what their actions and communications say about themselves than what other people's perceptions are. Archie thinks Meathead looks like a bum by choosing to let his freak flag fly, but Michael feels it would be inauthentic to cut his hair for the sake of getting a job. His thinking is not without merit because, as advocates for civil rights, he is putting himself in the position of his black neighbors. It is unjust that black people have more limited opportunities due to the color of their skin. Being black is innate and unchangeable, and an authentic part of someone's identity. It's also extremely visible, for the most part, which means that its portrayal is inherently sincere. It can't be faked. In the same way, we know the homeless veteran with missing limbs is sincere in expressing his need for alms, but we can't be as certain for the man who simply appears bedraggled. But in the culture of sincerity, he is given the benefit of the doubt because it's difficult to believe someone would choose to beg or live on the street if they had other choices available to them. Deception violates the rules of a culture of sincerity. But while a preference for long hair may be completely authentic and may even be innate and unchangeable, it is not readily recognizable as sincere. It seems like a purposeful rebellion against the norms and standards. Yet, despite Archie and Edith's inability to understand Michael and Gloria's strange life choices, how do they act? Do they put their foot down and force them to change? No. They continue to treat them as if their claims of authenticity are also sincere and allow them to remain living in their home. This is, by and large, what happens with the cultural shift from the silent generation to the baby boomers. The sincerity culture of their parents and elders simply let the claims of authenticity fly. And much of it was harmless. While there was a minority of people that got involved in the 60s psychedelic scene, the biggest impact that hippie culture had was aesthetic. By the 70s, long hair had become an accepted fashion. Business owners that would have refused to hire a long-haired hippie 10 years prior began to see that for most people, it was a sincere expression of authenticity. But this gradual shift from sincerity to authenticity had other effects. In the social sphere, the embrace of authenticity reduced the need for bounded communities with non-porous borders. The goal of embracing the authentic self was that it rejected the need for profilicity. You could be the same you everywhere you went. While people would still attend third places, the preference for those that valued authenticity began to outstrip ones that required the use of a certain persona. The bar was better than the church in this, but it also changed those established institutions. People used to dress up to eat out or attend the theater. Those standards became relaxed as the uniform of the authentic didn't feel the need to change clothes wherever they went. The Jesus People churches began with the come as you are mentality, but it gradually spread to many other churches and businesses as well. Business casual replaced the suit and tie at both places. All of this accelerated much more quickly due to television, where both parents and children were subject to messaging that affected them at multiple levels. All in the Family was in fact meant to promote new liberal values. Although it backfired slightly because more people identified positively with Archie, who was supposed to be the butt of all jokes, the eventual softening of his character provided a roadmap for the older and more conservative viewers to engage with the issues of the day. Thus, it could be well said that the culture of the 60s through the 80s, during the ascendancy of the baby boomers, was one of sincere authenticity. But when the same social trends continued from the late 80s into the 90s with Gen X, the search for authenticity became more extreme. While the hippie revolution meant a pushback on society roles in favor of certain personal preferences, the limitations imposed on society provided a level of feedback that informed them of limits and boundaries to their search for authenticity. They had to get degrees and jobs and start compartmentalizing their expressions of authentic identity to the weekends. But this meant that the Xers' childhood was radically different from that of the boomers. Though it was not a reaction, but an extension of the project, the parents of the Xers, some young boomers, others more educated and open-minded of the silent generation, were already on board with Project Authenticity. Authenticity goes off the rails. The radical change for these kids was that by growing up in an environment that sincerely valued authenticity, much of the external and societal models and tools for cultural training had already eroded. There was a greater multiplicity of roles and role models available to them, and less pushback for challenging assumptions. A great example of this is the show Freaks and Geeks, set in 1980 to 81, which follows two cadres of high school students connected by the Weir siblings. Lindsay Weir falls in with the Freaks, mostly juniors and seniors who are at the tail end of the baby boomer generation, while her younger brother Sam's group of friends are the Geeks, freshmen who represent the beginning of Gen X. Though the show only lasted one season, it was remarkably insightful in highlighting the lives of average students at that time. Not the movers and shakers of culture, but those who were sincerely adopting the changes of culture, while struggling in the search to find a personal identity through authenticity. As a testimony to the parents, their sincere allowance to accept what they don't understand about their children's search for authenticity is balanced by concern and communication. A notable example is that when Lindsay feels the weight of expectations to have sex with her boyfriend, her mother is aware enough to notice her troubled demeanor and spark a conversation. While the family is not religious, the importance of family values is both sincere and authentic enough to uphold certain values. Her father expresses remorse for losing his virginity to a Korean prostitute as a GI because his first time wasn't special, a remarkable story in the face of long-standing cultural propaganda that the authentic masculine identity doesn't care about such things. The key factor, which drives much of the humor, is that unlike the hippies who believed they had grasped some innate authenticity that stood in opposition to the cultural expectations of their parents, these kids are exploring a wide world of many available options in search of an authentic self, yet find themselves drawn to fringe cultures and behaviors through their exploration of niche musical genres and fashions. When one character decides that he is interested in a girl who is part of the underground punk scene, he decides that he must become punk to approach her. And when his friends ask why he is dressing differently, the answer is that This is who I am now. Pure profilicity, sincerely mistaken for authenticity. This highlights the change in which social groups begin to have greater influence in the formation of the identity. In the culture of sincerity, the bounded sets and the closed groups were the ones that defined a person's identity. The strict rules and high costs of participating were a means to enforce sincere participation. The centered set groups, those whose participation was voluntary, were superficial. Musical preferences, hobbies, business endeavors, even political affiliation were superficial aspects of a person's identity. But as authenticity took over, these centered sets became central, and as the need to differentiate oneself from the rest of the herd became an important part of forming an identity, it required the creation of more and more exclusive interests. Like the long hair of the 1970s, everything popular became passe. Identification with the fringe became the quickest route to securing an authentic identity. The curious change that happened is that all the formerly exclusive, bounded set institutions became porous and accessible. The centered set groups, um, as the formerly exclusive, bounded set institutions became porous and accessible, the centered set groups transformed to become non porous and exclusive. They were still centered sets in the sense that they were formed by volitional interest, but to gain acceptance required passing a test, not of sincerity, but of authenticity. To gain entry into the punk rock subculture, one had to demonstrate authenticity through their knowledge of the requisite bands and their history, while mimicking the aesthetic look, yet doing so in a way that is authentic. This often meant copying what others had done, but taking it further. The spiky hair got taller, the clothing more ripped, the body modification more intense. This happened across the board, as the mainstream of black culture was also transformed in the same ways. The older culture, embodied in the jazz and blues clubs of the 20th century and the black churches, with their emphasis on dressing well, gradually declined in popularity to be replaced by urban street culture, influenced by the fringe elements of pimps, drug dealers, gangs, and prison culture. Upward mobility was seen as an embrace of whiteness, and the authentic Black experience became centered around the experience of racism, victimhood, and oppression. These trends intensified into the 90s grunge scene, the triumph of our alternative subculture over the mainstream, and the embrace of irony signified the death of sincerity. In a surprisingly common scenario, many children found that when they became teenagers, their parents actively turned off the sincerity protocol that had driven their childhood upbringing when they had to behave in school and switched to an authenticity protocol, expecting their teenagers to find themselves by making mistakes and experimenting with alcohol, drugs, and sex. The baby boomer parents of these 90s teens were seen as the ultimate hypocrites, their boomerality laid bare in their own moderated return to the sex, drugs, and rock and roll of their youth. The 90s and aughts revealed that the boomers practiced profilicity in reverse. They could turn their authentic selves off for decades at a time and turn it back on when the burdens of parenthood were over or nearly over. But this happened at a sliding scale. The far more devastating program was enacted by the parents who were true believers in the culture of authenticity. By making the borders of family life completely porous and enforcing no rules, children were at a complete loss for negative examples to define their authentic selves against. The hippie culture and punk movements were decidedly anti establishment. They pushed against the boundaries enforced by the culture of sincerity and gradually toppled the institutions that made it function, closed groups with firm boundaries. In the absence of any such group context, children became increasingly autistic. not in the sense of an actual diagnosis, but rather they began to mimic the symptoms coming from the Latin root autos for the self. Selfism became the means of discovering the authentic self. The I became supreme, and in an attempt to discover the limits, children and teens began to push the parental boundaries of what was acceptable. Where this was overwhelmingly met with affirmation of self discovery, the collective boundaries were pushed farther and farther. This continued the trend of looking for external groups to affirm the authentic self. By the early days of the internet, there was already a massive number of musical subgenres and microgenres, of which a partial list, far from comprehensive, is found on Wikipedia. But while musical taste was the instrument through which the culture of authenticity was originally adopted, music itself became rather passe, and what was the fringe of the fringe, sexual deviation, became a much stronger core of identity. During the 60s and 70s, the feminist movement helped bring marginal awareness to gay and lesbian groups. The 80s AIDS epidemic helped them gain the sympathy of civil rights advocates, and by the 2000s, support for increased rights had already passed a tipping point. They simply needed the legislation to catch up, which it did quickly. 2001 in the Netherlands, 2004 in Massachusetts, followed by a slew of states, and it became the law of the land in 2015 due to the Obergefell decision. This was celebrated by many as a freedom for marginalized individuals to finally live as their authentic selves. But since that time, the same thing that happened to musical genres happened to sexuality, and then gender identification, a massive splintering into ever increasing subcategories of increasingly specific niches. The internet accelerated this massive splintering, as people could now find their communities anywhere in the world and form their identity on any number of things. Fandoms in gaming, movies, music, and pornography, which dovetailed with the sexual and gender aspects of identity. But the effect of this was that by cracking everything wide open and allowing free access to all the information, even the centered set communities could not stay together in any real form. The subjective nature of authenticity gave way fully to prophilicity. The postmodern insistence that everything was a social construct really took hold, and the old institutions were torn down or neutered of any means of enforcing their boundaries, whether through tests of sincerity or authenticity. The rise of prophilicity. There was a period of time when people realized the dual nature of authenticity and prophilicity. The 2007 song Online by Brad Paisley made a humorous send-up of the phenomenon. I work down at the Pizza Hut and I drive an old Hyundai. I still live with my mom and dad. I'm 5'3" and overweight. I'm a sci-fi fanatic, mild asthmatic, never been to second base, but there's a whole nother me that you need to see. Go check out my space. Because online, I'm out in Hollywood. I'm 6'5" and I look damn good. I drive a Maserati, I'm a black belt in karate, and I love a good glass of wine. It turns girls on that I'm mysterious. I tell them I don't want nothing serious, because even on a slow day, I can have a three-way chat with two women at one time. I'm so much cooler online. This was the era when prophilicity was used as a crutch to bolster the waning culture of authenticity. But while the song is presented as satire, increasingly the idea of crafting an identity through prophilicity was met with sincerity. In 2024, you are who you decide to be, but you prove it online. Prophilicity is reaching a crisis because at the end of the day, people still long to be in community, but the increasingly niche definitions of identity make it difficult for people to relate to one another. Because the base notion propping up the prophilicity is still authenticity and not sincerity, it's taboo to ask someone else to change or make accommodations for someone else. Combined with the powerful superstimuli of celebrity and influencer profiles that shape people's desires for companionship, prophilicity is insufficient to bind a culture together, apart from its digital infrastructure. Leibold points out a key aspect of how prophilicity works that will help us understand why. Quote, key to this form of identity is what the authors call second-order observation. Second-order observation is seeing oneself or anyone or anything else through the eyes of others. What matters is how others see you, and by others, they mean not one's immediate personal contacts, one's family and friends, but what they call the general peer. The general peer is what one thinks others are thinking. While this is generally true, it should be noted that there is not one general peer. The singular concept of a general peer is only accessible to the most massive profile, the Mr. Beasts of the world, maybe just Mr. Beast. Instead, people have to curate their profiles within their own strengths and abilities to find the niche peers who will validate their profiles. For the older generations, the decision to shape a profile for the general peer or a niche peer rather than for family and friends seems absurd. For those curating their profiles for adolescence and adulthood, their real-life friends will be part of their general peer because friendship is based on voluntary participation in regard to mutual interests. If someone is not interested in any of your likes, they cannot be considered a friend. Footnote. I'm not saying this is necessarily true, but it is how people think. And footnote. As to family, the parents of all prolific youth and young adults are locked in the culture of authenticity. They gladly accept and affirm whatever choices the individual makes about their self-identity, which makes them useless for crafting a profile. To reiterate the crucial point of prophilicity, these are not masks hiding a central identity, what one authentically is. They are not fragments of what one really is. They each, in their own way, constitute an identity. For Leibold, the shocking observation about prophilicity seems to be that there is no authentic center. This is only difficult to grasp for those with no experience being completely isolated from any group form of community. We know from experience and observation that prisoners subjected to extreme isolation quickly lose grasp of their authentic self, and we have in essence created a digital gulag. Culture and identity only emerge in relationships, much of which occurs through the random interactions of wounded exiles in a wasteland. The culture of perpetual sincerity. It only takes a few moments to realize that of the three aspects of sincerity, authenticity, and prophilicity, it is the culture of authenticity that must be placed at the bottom of the hierarchy. The authentic self is that which we believe to be innate, the thing not shaped by our experience or the external imposition of rules. We can call it nature or biology, though when it is placed at the top of the hierarchy, it seems to become spiritual, as we tend to believe people when they claim knowledge of a self that contradicts observable reality, a secret, sacred self. But because the individual is the sole possessor of this knowledge, they are required to communicate its nature and existence to those around them using the tools of relationality, language, and shared experience. The principal assumption of the culture of authenticity is the existence of this self, and in theory, it is present in each individual. Yet our culture displays a contradictory assumption. When people are unable to articulate the existence and nature of the self by using the learned tools of communication, we assume their self does not exist. This is evidenced by our willingness to end the life of an individual when they lose the ability to communicate. No one advocates for the authentic self that is unable to advocate for itself. Likewise, the proliferation of abortion and euthanasia coincides strongly with the cultural assumption of an authentic self, and oftentimes the people who insist most fervently on the reality of an authentic self are the ones advocating for the death of individuals who become incapacitated, in opposition to family members operating from a position of sincerity. This brings us to the strongest reason for rejecting the culture of authenticity. Each child is born into a family, at minimum, a bounded set of mother and child, though the child is equally aware of the existence of a father either by his presence or his absence. This relationship between mother and child represents the creation of a new cultural community with the implicit assumption of sincerity. To reassert the definition I began with, the difference between the cultural values of authenticity and sincerity is where the emphasis is placed on the communication of information or emotion between two people. In a culture of sincerity, the greater value is given to the recipient. It does not matter if the speaker is being authentic or inauthentic. By communicating in the form of a sincerity, the recipient is protected by taking them at their word. The consequences of a breach of trust land squarely on the speaker. It is not simply that communication between a baby and a mother should or must begin from sincerity. It simply does. If the mother chooses to give her baby up, ignore her, or abuse her, the resultant lack in identity formation rests solely on the mother. Likewise, the mother assumes the baby is both sincere and authentic in her limited communication. If she ignores the baby's cries for food and comfort, the baby will not learn how to communicate anything else. It is only after the baseline of a relationship is established in sincerity that the child begins to explore the other options. Authenticity emerges as the child learns to say no, asserting the existence of a self independent from the relationship with the parents. Her early imitations of her mother and father fit the descriptions of prophilicity, not masks hiding a central identity, what one authentically is. They are not fragments of what one really is. They each, in their own way, constitute an identity. Observable mimicry is the evidence of a child embodying a complete identity. She puts on mommy, daddy, or big sister, or even the puppy. Then comes the second order observations, seeing oneself or anyone or anything else through the eyes of others, observing how mommy and daddy look at each other, and noticing the similarities in how they look at her, how her countenance changes when they call her beautiful. The power of this innate assumption of sincerity is so great that it can lead to the manifestation of new realities. If the parents and teachers can persist in communicating the vision of the world they wish to create. In the early 1960s, a whole generation had been injected by the teaching that reason leads only to pessimism in the area of a meaning of life and of any values. Students had been hearing this from their professors for a long time. As a matter of fact, there was a generation that had never been taught anything else. But there was an inconsistency here, because most of these professors who taught that life had no meaning and there were no fixed values, they didn't live that way. They were living in the memory of the past. But we should not have been surprised that at a certain point in time, one generation would really act, upon what they have been taught. Footnote: Francis Schaeffer from How Should We Then Live, Episode 9, Personal Peace and Affluence. And so the bitter, selfish, and insincere academics of the early 60s, the ones whose big brains had languished in obscurity while America celebrated its war heroes, took advantage of that culture of sincerity and the innate trust of the youth to inflict a serious betrayal on their students. They decided to pitch all their grievances with the status quo as the final barriers between reality and utopia and equipped their students with the necessary tools to tear them down. In combination with the messaging of mass media, this whole enterprise was framed as the embrace of authenticity. The culture of authenticity was always predicated on lies, such as Freud's infantile sexuality. He posited that a baby at the breast was driven by libido. But if this was the case, we would have been using suction tests to earmark a potential rapists and given parents warning about boys whose teeth come in too quickly. Sometimes things go wrong, but the correlation between the care and attention paid during that long process of nurture and the adults that eventually emerge is far too strong to be attributed to an authentic self. And that is the and it is that latent nurture, the sincerity of loving mothers and fathers, even when they have been horribly informed about the authentic nature of their child, that produces the hopeful results for the future. Even in the world of profilicity, it's easy to imagine that everyone wants to be porn stars and pimps. But for most people to achieve maximum success in the culture of profilicity, both sincere authenticity and authentic sincerity are still required. The profile reflects what they received and what they are, but also allows for what they hope to be.